Cape Town in 1959 was a city marked by profound contradictions and deep-rooted divisions that seemed impossible to reconcile. It was a physically beautiful city, with Table Mountain dominating the landscape from virtually every vantage point, rising dramatically above the city, visible from most neighborhoods, a constant geographical reminder of the natural world's grandeur. The harbor provided economic and strategic importance, serving as a port for international trade, for fishing operations, for military significance. Colonial architecture from previous centuries remained as testament to centuries of history. British, Dutch, indigenous African, layered upon each other in the physical structure of the city. But beauty and history could not conceal the fundamental reality of the time. Cape Town in 1959 was a city under strict and systematic racial segregation. The beauty of the landscape and the richness of the history existed in contradiction with the ugliness of racial division that characterized every day, every interaction, every institutional arrangement. South Africa in 1959 was in the firm grip of apartheid, a system of legalized racial segregation and systematic discrimination that had been formally established as government policy since 1948. Apartheid was not merely social segregation or individual prejudice. It was encoded into law, enforced by government, implemented systematically through every institution and every level of society. Apartheid represented a comprehensive, systematic effort to divide human beings according to racial classification and to establish rigid hierarchies of power, privilege, and access based on these classifications. The apartheid system divided South African society into rigid racial categories. There were whites, classified as the superior racial group with all political power and most economic power. There were blacks, referred to in apartheid terminology as natives, classified as the inferior racial group with no political power and limited economic opportunity, confined to designated areas, subject to severe restrictions on movement and employment. There were coloreds, a term applied to people of mixed race, classified in an intermediate position between whites and blacks. There were Indians and Asians, classified as Asiatic people with severely limited rights, restricted in their ability to own property, to attend universities, to work in certain professions. The apartheid system controlled where people could live, where they could work, where they could travel, where they could receive education, where they could receive medical care, even where they could eat and use facilities. Segregation was comprehensive and systematic. The laws that enforced apartheid were detailed and specific, regulating every aspect of daily life. Violations of apartheid laws could result in imprisonment and criminal penalties, including long-term imprisonment for serious violations. Cape Town was a center of political and social power in South Africa. It was where government institutions were located. It was where wealth and influence were concentrated. The city was highly stratified, divided by race, by class, by power. Those with power were primarily white, primarily wealthy, primarily connected to government and institutional structures. Those without power were relegated to designated areas, to limited economic opportunities, to restricted access to institutions and resources. The broader social environment in 1959 was one of increasing tension over apartheid. The apartheid government was intensifying its enforcement of racial separation. The government was enacting increasingly restrictive laws. The government was building the infrastructure of apartheid control. More restricted areas, more pass laws, more restrictions on movement and employment. Resistance to apartheid was growing, though resistance was severely repressed by government authorities. Organizations were being banned. Leaders were being arrested. Dissent was being crushed. The year 1959 itself marked a period of intensification of apartheid policies and increased government repression of opposition. The government was demonstrating that it would not tolerate challenges to apartheid. The government was demonstrating that it would use force, legal persecution, imprisonment, and social pressure to maintain the apartheid system. In this environment of intensifying racial repression and increasing government control, a murder would occur within one of Cape Town's most prestigious institutions. Cape Town Gardens Hospital was one of the premier medical institutions not only in Cape Town, but in all of South Africa. It was located in the Gardens area, a prestigious neighborhood near the city center. an area characterized by wealth, by grand houses, by manicured gardens, by the aesthetic markers of privilege and power. The neighborhood was one where the wealthy and the influential lived. The neighborhood was designed to reflect status and social position. The hospital was an impressive physical structure, a building that conveyed solidity, permanence, and institutional authority. The hospital had been constructed in the late 19th century and had been expanded and modernized over the subsequent decades. The building reflected architectural styles of different periods, but it was unified by the impression of institutional permanence and medical expertise. By 1959, the hospital represented the most modern medical facilities available in South Africa at that time. Cape Town Gardens Hospital served primarily white patients, particularly those who were wealthy or connected to powerful institutions. The hospital had a reputation for excellence that extended not just throughout South Africa, but internationally. The hospital employed some of the most skilled doctors in South Africa. The hospital had modern medical equipment. The hospital had a system of nursing care that was considered among the best available. The hospital was known for its achievements in medical care, its innovations in treatment, its contribution to medical knowledge. The hospital was seen as a prestigious institution, a place where important people, government officials, business leaders, wealthy merchants, influential professionals, university leaders, went for medical treatment. Being treated at Cape Town Gardens Hospital was itself a marker of status and privilege. The hospital was where power went when illness struck. The hospital was where the elite of Cape Town and beyond sought medical care. But like all institutions in apartheid-era South Africa, the hospital was organized according to strict racial hierarchies. The most senior positions were held by white men, the doctors, the senior administrators, the leadership of the institution. Women, regardless of race, were relegated to nursing positions that were considered appropriately caring and service-oriented for women, positions that were subordinate to male physicians. The highest a woman could typically rise within the institution was to a senior nursing position, but even this was subordinate to medical doctors, who were almost exclusively male. Staff members from non-white racial backgrounds were assigned to the least prestigious work: cleaning, maintenance, food service, laundry. These staff members worked in the hospital but were completely segregated from white staff. They used different facilities. They ate in separate dining areas. They had different uniforms and different status markers that made their racial classification and lower status immediately visible. They had different rights and privileges within the institution. The racial segregation within the hospital reflected and reinforced the broader apartheid system. White patients were treated by white doctors and primarily white nurses. Non-white patients, if they received treatment at Cape Town Gardens Hospital at all, were treated in segregated wards and were cared for by non-white staff members. The hospital's organization embodied the racial hierarchy of apartheid. The nursing staff at Cape Town Gardens Hospital in 1959 consisted primarily of white women, many of whom were trained nurses with professional credentials obtained through formal nursing education. There were also nursing aides from various backgrounds, and there were non-white nursing staff members who worked in lower status positions: ward assistants, nursing aides, support staff. The nursing hierarchy itself reflected racial and gender hierarchies. The hospital had an administrative structure that reflected both the institutional hierarchy and the apartheid system. There were senior administrators, typically white men. There were middle-level managers and supervisors. There were professional staff like doctors and senior nurses. There was support staff. The entire structure was organized according to race and gender, with whites at the top, with men above women, with professional staff above support staff. Elizabeth Mary Hartley was 31 years old when she was murdered on the night of June 2nd to 3rd, 1959. She was a registered nurse, a professional who had received formal training in nursing and who had obtained professional credentials and licensing that marked her as a qualified, trained professional. Elizabeth had been born in England, specifically in a small town in the Midlands called Dudley. She was born in 1928, during the period between the two world wars, into a family that was solidly middle-class and educated. Her father, George Hartley, had been a schoolmaster, a teacher in one of the secondary schools in the Midlands. Her mother, Margaret Hartley, née Thompson, had been a homemaker, a woman of the professional middle class who was educated, cultured, and engaged with the intellectual life of her community. The Hartley family had valued education highly. George Hartley had been well educated, having attended university and having pursued a career in education. He had been a respected teacher, known for his commitment to education and his students. Margaret Hartley had been from an educated family as well. She had been raised in an environment that valued learning and intellectual engagement. The household was one where books were present, where intellectual engagement was valued, where the importance of learning was emphasized. Education was seen as the path to a better life, to professional achievement, to social contribution. Elizabeth had been educated in the English school system of the 1930s and 1940s. She had attended secondary school and had demonstrated aptitude for academic subjects. She was an intelligent girl, capable of pursuing various professional paths. But from an early age, Elizabeth had expressed interest in nursing. She had been drawn to the idea of caring for people, of working in a profession that was fundamentally about helping others, of serving in a role that combined intellectual knowledge with practical care and human compassion. As a young woman, Elizabeth had pursued formal nursing training. She had attended a teaching hospital in Birmingham, one of the major industrial cities of the Midlands. The training program had been rigorous and demanding. It had combined theoretical knowledge about medicine, anatomy, and healthcare with practical clinical experience in actual hospital wards. Elizabeth had spent years learning the theory and practice of nursing. She had completed her nursing training and had obtained her professional nursing registration, credentials that marked her as a qualified, trained professional nurse, recognized and licensed by the Nursing Regulatory Authority. By the late 1940s, Elizabeth Hartley was a registered nurse working in England. She had begun her professional career during the period after World War II, during a time of reconstruction and renewal in Britain. The post-war period was characterized by significant social change, by the creation of the National Health Service in 1948, by new opportunities for women in the workforce. Elizabeth had worked in various hospitals in the Midlands, gaining experience in different types of nursing, working with different patient populations, developing her skills and expertise as a professional nurse. In 1951, at the age of 23, Elizabeth had made a significant decision about her future. She had decided to immigrate to South Africa. This decision had been influenced by several factors. South Africa in the early 1950s was actively recruiting skilled workers from Britain, including nurses and doctors. The South African government had established recruitment programs specifically targeting British professionals. There was a shortage of skilled nursing personnel in South Africa. South Africa represented opportunity for skilled professionals. Elizabeth had been attracted by the employment opportunities available to her. She had also been drawn by the prospect of adventure, by the opportunity to work in a new country, by the desire to experience a different part of the world, by the possibility of building a new life in a new place. For a young, single, professional woman in 1951, immigration to a developing country could represent both professional opportunity and personal adventure. Elizabeth had made arrangements for her immigration. She had applied for positions in South Africa. She had been hired by Cape Town Gardens Hospital to work as a registered nurse. In 1951, Elizabeth had boarded a ship from England and had traveled to South Africa, to Cape Town, to her new life. The journey had taken weeks by sea. She had arrived in Cape Town in the early 1950s, disembarked from the ship, and began her new life in South Africa. Elizabeth Hartley arrived in Cape Town in 1951, at the age of 23. She began work at Cape Town Gardens Hospital in 1951. She was assigned to work as a registered nurse in the hospital's wards, providing direct patient care, working under the supervision of senior nurses and physicians, gradually developing expertise and professional standing within the hospital. The early years in South Africa represented a period of adjustment for Elizabeth. She was adapting to a new country, a new climate, a new culture. She was adjusting to work in a new hospital system, working with new colleagues, learning new procedures and protocols. She was adjusting to living in South Africa during the early years of apartheid, witnessing the racial segregation that was so different from anything in her experience in England. But Elizabeth adapted. She was professional, competent, and dedicated to her work. She developed relationships with her colleagues. She learned the systems and procedures of the hospital. She became proficient in her work. She developed a reputation as a capable nurse who could be relied upon. By 1951, approximately 8 years after her arrival in South Africa in 1951, Elizabeth Hartley had been working at Cape Town Gardens Hospital for nearly a decade. She was well established in her position. She was respected by her colleagues. She had developed professional relationships with doctors and senior nurses. She was known as a dedicated nurse who was conscientious about patient care, who took her professional responsibilities seriously, who maintained high professional standards. Elizabeth lived alone in a small flat in the Gardens area, not far from the hospital where she worked. The flat was modest but comfortable, appropriate for a single professional woman of moderate means. It was within walking distance of the hospital, which was convenient for her work schedule, particularly when she was working shifts that began or ended at unusual hours. The Gardens area was an attractive, well-maintained neighborhood with tree-lined streets, with gardens and green spaces, with an atmosphere of middle-class respectability and relative prosperity. Elizabeth had developed close friendships with other nurses at the hospital. She was part of a social circle of professional nurses, many of whom were, like her, British women who had immigrated to South Africa to work as nurses. These women shared similar backgrounds, similar experiences of having left Britain to work in South Africa, similar challenges of adapting to life in a new country, similar experience of working in the South African medical system. These friendships were meaningful and sustaining. Elizabeth was involved in community activities outside of the hospital. She attended church regularly. She was a member of the local Anglican church in the Gardens area. She participated in church activities and social events. She was involved in church community life. Religion and faith were clearly important to her. The church provided her with a community, with social connections, with spiritual grounding, with a sense of belonging to something larger than herself. Elizabeth was engaged in the broader life of Cape Town. She attended social events. She had friends outside of the nursing profession. She pursued interests and hobbies. She read. She enjoyed films. She participated in community activities. She was known among her acquaintances as a pleasant, professional woman. She was respected for her competence and her dedication to her work. She was liked for her friendly personality and her genuine interest in people. By 1959, Elizabeth Hartley had been living in Cape Town for approximately 8 years since her arrival in 1951. She had established herself as a permanent resident of the city. She had a job that she valued, a profession in which she took pride. She had a social circle and a community that valued her. She had built a life for herself in South Africa, a life that was different from the life she might have lived in England, a life that was constructed across cultures and continents, a life that she had chosen and built through her own decisions and efforts. By all accounts, Elizabeth was a competent, professional, dedicated nurse. She had no enemies that anyone was aware of. She had no significant conflicts with colleagues. She seemed to be living a quiet, productive professional life. She appeared to be content with her existence, secure in her career, established in her community. She was a woman who had made a life for herself in a foreign country through competence, dedication, and professionalism. The nursing operations at Cape Town Gardens Hospital were organized around a 24-hour cycle of care. Patients required constant monitoring, constant access to care, constant professional attention throughout the day and night. Medical conditions did not pause at night. Patients did not stop needing care when darkness fell. To provide this continuous care, nursing staff worked in shifts. There was a day shift, typically from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., or 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., depending on the specific ward and the hospital's scheduling system. There was an afternoon shift, typically from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. or 4 p.m. to midnight, overlapping with both day shift and night shift, providing continuity of care. There was a night shift, typically from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. or midnight to 8 a.m. The night shift was the least desirable shift for many nurses. The night shift meant working during hours when most of society was sleeping. It meant working in a hospital environment that was quieter, less bustling, less populated. It meant working when darkness was outside, when the normal rhythms of society had shifted. It meant adjusting one's natural sleep rhythms to work during nighttime hours and to sleep during daytime hours. It meant missing many of the social and recreational opportunities that were available during daytime hours. It meant working while the rest of the world slept, a kind of professional isolation that some nurses found challenging, but some nurses preferred the night shift. The night shift often provided a different type of nursing experience. The night shift involved different types of patient care than the day shift. Many patients slept during the night shift, which meant less acute patient demands during night hours, fewer active treatments and procedures, fewer crises and emergencies. The night shift involved monitoring patients, maintaining the ward environment, responding to patient needs when they arose, maintaining basic comfort and care. The night shift involved coordinating with doctors if medical emergencies arose, though emergencies were less common during night hours than during the day. The night shift at Cape Town Gardens Hospital, particularly on the medical wards, typically involved a night sister, a senior nurse who was in charge of the night shift, and who supervised other nurses and nursing aides. The night sister was responsible for overall ward management, for making nursing decisions, for coordinating care. There would be several registered nurses assigned to various areas of the ward, with responsibility for patient care in their specific areas. There would be nursing aides to assist with patient care and maintenance tasks. There might be a doctor on call who could be contacted if medical emergencies occurred, though doctors were typically not present in the hospital during night hours unless there was a specific emergency. The working conditions on the night shift were different from day shift. The ward was quieter. There was less activity. The pace was different. Nurses had more time to attend to individual patients, to spend time in conversation with patients who were awake, to address patients' comfort needs. But the night shift also involved challenges: physical fatigue from working through the night, psychological challenges of working when darkness was outside and sleep was being sacrificed, the need to maintain vigilance and alertness even when the ward was quiet. On the night of June 2nd, 3rd, 1959, Elizabeth Hartley was working the night shift in the medical ward at Cape Town Gardens Hospital. She was one of the registered nurses assigned to the ward. She would have been responsible for patient monitoring in her assigned area, for responding to patient needs, for maintaining ward operations, for coordinating with other staff, for reporting any changes in patient conditions to senior nurses or doctors. She would have been engaged in the routine nursing work of the night shift, monitoring vital signs, responding to patient calls, administering medications as needed, maintaining patient comfort and safety. The hospital building was a substantial structure, with multiple floors and multiple wards. There were numerous areas within the hospital: patient wards, operating rooms, recovery rooms, storage areas, utility areas, administrative offices, staff facilities, laboratories. The building was large and complex. It contained many rooms and many spaces. The layout of the building was such that it was possible for a person to move through various areas, and encounters might or might not occur, depending on the time of day, the staffing patterns, the specific locations involved. During the night shift, many areas of the hospital would be quiet and relatively unoccupied. The administrative offices would be empty, with no administrative staff present. Most staff would be focused on the patient care areas. There would be areas of the hospital that saw little activity during the night shift. There would be areas that were used primarily by night shift staff, areas that would be quiet and relatively secluded. Staffing on the night shift was minimal compared to day shift staffing. There might be a security guard at the main entrance of the hospital, though the level of security was not elaborate. Security was not considered a major concern at the hospital in 1959. Access to the building was relatively unrestricted. Anyone with a staff badge or anyone who appeared to belong to the hospital could move through the building without significant obstruction or questioning. The hospital operated under the racial segregation system that characterized all of South African society in 1959. There were segregated spaces for white staff and non-white staff. There were segregated areas for patient care. The segregation extended to nearly every aspect of hospital operations. On the evening of June 2, 1959, Elizabeth Hartley reported for duty for her night shift at Cape Town Gardens Hospital. She would have arrived at the hospital perhaps 15 to 30 minutes before the shift was scheduled to begin, arriving to prepare for work, to review any information about the patients she would be caring for, to receive a briefing from the day shift staff about the status of patients, and any special needs or concerns that the night shift should be aware of. The day shift staff would provide information about which patients were stable, which patients required careful monitoring, which patients had new medications or treatments, which patients had been particularly difficult or problematic, which patients had been sleeping well or poorly. This transfer of information was crucial to ensuring continuity of care across shifts. The day shift nurses would hand over responsibility for patient care to the night shift nurses. The night shift would formally begin at 10 p.m. Elizabeth would have settled into her duties. She would have reviewed patient charts for her assigned patients. She would have reviewed physician orders and notes. She would have observed patients to ensure they were comfortable and stable. She would have introduced herself to patients if she had not cared for them previously. She would have begun the routine of night shift nursing, monitoring vital signs, responding to patient calls, maintaining the ward environment, ensuring patient comfort and safety. The night was typical for early June in Cape Town. The weather was mild. It was winter in the southern hemisphere, so the nights were cool, but not extremely cold, not bitterly cold, manageable for someone outdoors. The night of June the 2nd-3rd was apparently clear. There was no rain. There were no unusual weather conditions that would have affected the hospital's operations or staff movements. As the night progressed, the hospital would have settled into the quieter rhythm of night shift operations. Most patients would have been sleeping. The wards would have been relatively quiet. The pace of nursing activities would have been different from the daytime pace, more focused on monitoring, on responding to patient needs when they arose, on maintaining comfort and basic care, less focused on the active treatments and procedures that characterize daytime hospital operations. Elizabeth Hartley would have been performing her nursing duties. She would have been moving through the ward and surrounding areas, attending to patients, monitoring their conditions, responding to any needs or discomfort. She would have been interacting with other night shift staff, the night sister, other nurses, nursing aides. She would have been maintaining the professional routine of nursing care. At some point during the night shift, something occurred that would change everything. At some point during the night of June 2nd, 3rd, 1959, Elizabeth Hartley encountered something or someone that would result in her death. At some point during the night shift, murder occurred within the walls of Cape Town Gardens Hospital. At approximately 6:30 a.m. on the morning of June 3rd, 1959, the night shift was ending and the day shift was beginning. A member of the cleaning staff arrived for her morning shift at Cape Town Gardens Hospital. The cleaning staff member was a woman employed to clean the medical ward and surrounding areas. She was not a registered nurse, not a professional staff member in the medical sense, but a support staff member, likely from a non-white racial background, given the segregated structure of the hospital, employed to maintain the cleanliness of the hospital environment. The cleaning staff member was moving through the ward, preparing to begin her cleaning duties. She would have expected to find the ward relatively quiet, with patients still sleeping or just waking, with night shift staff preparing to hand over to day shift staff. She would have expected to begin her routine cleaning tasks, sweeping, mopping, emptying waste, cleaning and disinfecting surfaces. She approached a storage room, a room used for storing medical supplies, for storing clean linens, for storing various materials needed for patient care and ward maintenance. This storage room was not typically a place where significant activity occurred. It was a utility space, a functional space, not a patient care area. When the cleaning staff member opened the storage room door, she discovered Elizabeth Hartley's body. Elizabeth was lying on the floor of the storage room. She was fully clothed in her nursing uniform. Her appearance suggested that she had been subjected to violence. There were marks visible on her neck suggesting that she had been strangled. The neck bore bruising consistent with hands having been applied to her throat. Pressure maintained until consciousness ceased, and then until death occurred. The pattern of bruising was consistent with manual strangulation, with a person's hands applied to her throat. There were bruises visible on her face, on her head, suggesting that she had been struck repeatedly. Her face bore evidence of violence. The trauma suggested rage or desperation, or both. Her clothing was disheveled, torn in places, suggesting that there had been a struggle. Her uniform was disturbed, suggesting close physical contact, suggesting a fight or physical confrontation. The scene itself bore evidence of disorder, objects disturbed, evidence of a physical altercation that had occurred within this confined space. The storage room bore evidence that violence had happened here. The discovery of Elizabeth's body created immediate alarm throughout the hospital. The discovery was shocking, unexpected, terrifying. The cleaning staff member screamed. Her scream alerted other staff. Other staff members came to investigate. Word spread rapidly through the hospital that a nurse had been found dead, that a death had occurred within the hospital, that something terrible had happened. The discovery was immediately reported to the night sister, the senior nurse on the night shift. The night sister reported the discovery to hospital administration. Hospital administrators were awakened. Police were called. Within minutes. The morning of June 3, 1959, at Cape Town Gardens Hospital, transformed from a normal morning transition between shifts into a crisis situation. A death had occurred. A nurse had been murdered. The stability and normalcy of the institution had been shattered. Police arrived at the hospital at approximately 7:00 a.m. The first officers to arrive were patrol officers, not specialized investigators. They examined the storage room where Elizabeth's body lay. They began preliminary investigation of the scene. They established a perimeter around the storage room to preserve evidence. The initial police officers recognized the significance of what they had encountered. A nurse had been murdered within the hospital. A woman had been killed in a workplace setting. A crime of significant severity had occurred. This was not a minor incident. This was a serious crime requiring serious investigation. Police began preliminary investigation of the scene. They photographed the body, documenting the position of the body, the clothing, the bruising, the evidence of violence. They photographed the storage room, documenting the condition of the room, the evidence of struggle, the position of objects in the room. Police began to collect preliminary evidence. The initial investigation suggested clearly that Elizabeth had been murdered. The marks on her neck were consistent with strangulation. The bruising on her face and head suggested violence. The disheveled condition of her clothing and the scene itself suggested a violent struggle. This was not a death from natural causes. This was not an accident. This was murder. Police began to establish a timeline. When had Elizabeth last been seen alive? When had the murder occurred? When had Elizabeth's body been discovered? This timeline would be crucial to the investigation. If the murder had occurred during the night shift, between approximately 10:00 p.m. and 6:30 a.m., then the investigation would focus on who had been present in the hospital during that time. Police began to interview hospital staff present at the time. They asked staff members where they had been during the night. They asked whether anyone had seen Elizabeth during the night shift. They asked whether anyone had heard anything unusual. They asked whether anyone had observed anything suspicious or concerning. Police began the process of collecting evidence from the storage room and from Elizabeth's body. They collected fibers, hair samples, any physical evidence that might connect a perpetrator to the scene or to Elizabeth. They photographed the scene from multiple angles, documenting the evidence present at the scene. They were attempting to gather evidence that might identify the perpetrator. As the police investigation proceeded during the morning hours of June 3, 1959, hospital administration began to intervene in the investigation. Hospital administrators stated that they needed to be involved in the investigation because the crime had occurred on hospital premises. Hospital administrators claimed that they had an institutional interest in how the investigation was conducted and how the hospital was portrayed during the investigation. Hospital administrators began to restrict police access to certain areas of the hospital. Hospital administrators requested that police interviews with hospital staff be conducted with hospital administrators present, claiming that they needed to protect the interests of the hospital and to ensure that hospital policies were not violated during interviews. Hospital administrators claimed that certain information was confidential hospital business and that police did not have the right to access certain records or certain areas without hospital authorization. The chief administrator of Cape Town Gardens Hospital at this time was a man named Dr. Charles Pemberton. Dr. Pemberton was a physician who had taken on administrative responsibilities, having transitioned from clinical medical practice to hospital management. Pemberton was a powerful figure in Cape Town, not just within the hospital, but in the broader city. He had connections to government officials. He had connections to police leadership. He had connections to the business and professional elite of Cape Town. Pemberton was accustomed to exercising authority and to having his decisions respected by those within and outside the hospital. Dr. Pemberton was deeply concerned about the impact that a murder investigation at Cape Town Gardens Hospital would have on the hospital's reputation. Pemberton understood that a scandal, a murder within the hospital, A crisis situation could damage the hospital's carefully cultivated image as a prestigious, safe, excellent institution. Pemberton was concerned about the hospital's status as a leading medical institution. Pemberton was concerned about the implications of a scandal on the hospital's ability to attract wealthy patients, to maintain its reputation for excellence, to retain its position of prominence in Cape Town society. Pemberton began to insert himself into the investigation. Pemberton involved himself in decisions about how the investigation would proceed. Pemberton claimed that the hospital had an interest in protecting its reputation and its operations. Pemberton claimed that a full public investigation, conducted in the manner that police typically conducted investigations, would be damaging to the hospital. Pemberton claimed that the hospital needed to manage the situation carefully to minimize damage to the institution. Pemberton claimed that hospital business should have priority over police investigation procedures. Pemberton claimed that certain areas of the hospital should not be subjected to police searching and investigation. Pemberton claimed that certain hospital staff should not be subjected to extensive police questioning, claiming that this would interfere with hospital operations. Pemberton claimed that certain hospital records should remain confidential and should not be made available to police without hospital authorization and oversight. Police investigators found themselves increasingly constrained by hospital administration's interference. Investigators who attempted to conduct thorough interviews of hospital staff found that hospital administrators were blocking their access to staff. Hospital administrators claimed that certain staff members were essential to hospital operations and could not be removed from their duties for extended questioning. Hospital administrators claimed that police questioning should be brief and minimal, conducted with hospital administrators present. Investigators who attempted to examine hospital records found that administrators claimed certain records were confidential. Administrators claimed that hospital policy required that certain records be kept confidential and could not be provided to police. Administrators claimed that police did not have authority to access certain categories of hospital information, claiming that medical records were protected by confidentiality and privacy laws. The tension between police investigators and hospital administration escalated and intensified. Police investigators were accustomed to conducting investigations according to established procedures that had evolved over decades of police practice. These procedures included accessing relevant information from institutions, interviewing relevant witnesses, examining relevant evidence. Police investigators understood that hospitals, like other institutions, might have certain confidentiality policies regarding medical information, but police believed that a murder investigation, an investigation into a serious crime, took priority over confidentiality concerns. Murder was a serious crime, and solving a serious crime required the ability to investigate thoroughly. Hospital administration believed differently. Hospital administration believed that the hospital's interests and the hospital's reputation should be protected, even in the context of a murder investigation. Hospital administration believed that an extensive, intrusive police investigation conducted in the manner that police typically conducted investigations would be damaging to the institution. Hospital administration believed that the hospital should control the scope and extent of police investigation into a crime that had occurred within the hospital. The power dynamics were complex. Police had legal authority to conduct investigations, but hospital administration had power and influence within Cape Town society, and potentially had connections to police leadership that could influence how the investigation proceeded. Police investigators found themselves facing institutional resistance from a powerful institution with connections to government and police leadership. A crucial detail emerged in the investigation that would prove to be deeply significant. Certain patient records from the medical ward had gone missing. Specifically, records for patients in certain beds on the medical ward where Elizabeth had been working could not be located. These were medical records, files that contained patient information, medical histories, treatment notes, medication information. When police attempted to examine these records, hospital administrators stated that the records had been removed for archival purposes. Hospital administrators stated that the records were being processed and could not be made available to police. Hospital administrators stated that hospital policy required that certain records be kept confidential and could not be provided to police. The missing patient records were highly significant for several reasons. Patient records could have provided information about what had occurred on the medical ward during the night shift. Patient records could have provided information about patients Elizabeth had been treating that evening. Patient records could have included notes about patient conditions, patient medications, patient interactions with staff. Patient records could have contained information about unusual occurrences, about problems, about anything that Elizabeth might have observed or been involved in. Additionally, the records could have contained information that might provide clues about motive for Elizabeth's murder. Had Elizabeth been treating particular patients? Had something unusual occurred in the treatment of these patients? Had Elizabeth observed something unusual? Had Elizabeth been concerned about something she had observed? Had Elizabeth taken an action that might have motivated someone to commit violence against her? The disappearance of patient records raised questions. Why would patient records for this particular ward, for this particular time, go missing at precisely the time when police were attempting to investigate a murder? The timing was suspicious. The coincidence was too great to be mere chance. But the records had disappeared. The records could not be located. Whether they had been deliberately removed to conceal evidence, or whether there was another explanation, was unclear. But the fact that the records were missing when police were attempting to investigate the murder was highly suspicious. The disappearance of the records suggested that there was something in those records that someone wanted to conceal. Police requested that hospital administration locate the missing records and make them available for investigation. Hospital administration delayed responding to the request. Hospital administration claimed that searching for the records would take significant time and resources. Hospital administration claimed that the records could not be located. Hospital administration suggested that the records might have been lost or mislaid in the process of filing or archiving. Hospital administration maintained that the records were unavailable and could not be made available to police. As days passed following Elizabeth's death, the police investigation began to stall. The investigation was making no progress toward identifying a suspect or establishing a clear understanding of what had occurred. The investigation had produced no arrests. The investigation had produced no clear leads. The investigation appeared to be stuck, unable to move forward. Multiple factors contributed to the stalling of the investigation. Hospital administration's interference was a significant factor. The restriction of police access to hospital staff, the restriction of police access to hospital records, the obstruction of the investigation. All of these factors hindered the investigation and made it difficult for police to conduct a thorough investigation. Police investigators were unable to conduct the thorough investigation that they believed was necessary to solve a serious crime. Additionally, the broader political and social context of apartheid-era South Africa created an environment in which institutional interests were often prioritized over the interests of justice. Powerful institutions like hospitals were generally given significant deference by police. Institutions with connections to government had the ability to influence police investigations. Police leadership understood that powerful institutions had significant political protection, and that challenging powerful institutions could have career consequences for police personnel involved in the investigation. The hospital had powerful connections. Dr. Pemberton had connections to government officials at various levels. The hospital had wealthy and influential patients and supporters throughout Cape Town and beyond. The hospital had significant institutional standing in Cape Town society. These factors meant that the hospital was in a position to resist police investigation and to influence the direction and scope of the investigation. Additionally, the apartheid context meant that institutional power was heavily protected. Powerful white institutions, and the hospital was certainly a powerful white institution, were generally protected by the state. The state prioritized the interests of powerful institutions over the interests of justice in many cases. The state was not equally committed to investigating all crimes. Some crimes, in certain contexts, were treated as less urgent, less worthy of resources than others. Police investigators became frustrated with their inability to conduct a thorough investigation, but they faced constraints from hospital administration and from the broader institutional environment in which they were operating. Police leadership seemed reluctant to press the investigation vigorously against the opposition of powerful hospital administration. Police leadership seemed to accept hospital administration's claims about confidentiality and institutional interests, Police leadership did not push back against hospital administration's obstruction. As the investigation proceeded without producing an arrest or clear suspect, various theories emerged attempting to explain who had murdered Elizabeth Hartley and what the motive might have been. Theory 1. A patient or visitor. One theory was that Elizabeth had been murdered by a patient or by a visitor to a patient. The theory suggested that perhaps Elizabeth had encountered someone in the hospital who had become violent, who had attacked her without clear provocation, or who had attacked her for reasons rooted in the interaction between them. The theory suggested that perhaps a patient had been disturbed, confused, or violent, and had attacked Elizabeth in response to something she had said or done. Or perhaps a visitor to a hospital patient had committed the crime, but establishing who this person might have been was difficult, particularly given that hospital administration was restricting access to patient information and to hospital visitor records. Police did not have clear information about which patients had been in the medical ward, which visitors had been in the hospital, which individuals had had access to the area where Elizabeth was murdered. The hospital's restriction of access to patient and visitor information made it difficult or impossible to pursue this line of investigation. Theory 2. A hospital staff member. A second theory was that Elizabeth had been murdered by someone who worked at the hospital. The theory suggested that perhaps a staff member had harbored some conflict with Elizabeth, or had attacked her for reasons rooted in hospital workplace dynamics. The theory suggested that perhaps another nurse, or a doctor, or a member of support staff had committed the murder. Perhaps there had been a workplace conflict that had escalated to violence. Perhaps there had been a personal conflict that had motivated the murder, but identifying which staff member might be responsible was difficult. Given hospital administration's interference with the investigation and the restriction of access to staff interviews, police could not conduct the thorough interviews that would have been necessary to identify a suspect among hospital staff. Additionally, staff members might have been reluctant to speak freely to police if hospital administration had discouraged such cooperation, or had made clear that the hospital did not want extensive police investigation. Theory 3. An unknown perpetrator, or external intruder. A third theory was that Elizabeth had been murdered by someone outside of the hospital, someone with no connection to the hospital, someone who had gained access to the hospital for the purpose of committing the murder. But this theory struggled to explain several aspects of the case. How would an outsider have had access to the hospital? How would an outsider have known where Elizabeth was? How would an outsider have known to target Elizabeth specifically? The theory did not adequately address these questions. Theory 4. Something more complex. A connection between murder and missing records. Another line of thinking suggested that the murder might be connected to something that had occurred on the medical ward, something involving patients, something involving treatment, something that Elizabeth might have observed, or that Elizabeth might have been involved in. The theory suggested that perhaps Elizabeth had witnessed something, or had taken an action, or had learned something that had prompted someone to commit murder to silence her, or to prevent her from revealing what she knew. The theory also connected the disappearance of patient records to the murder. Perhaps the records contained information about what Elizabeth had witnessed, or about what had occurred that had motivated the murder. Perhaps the records had been deliberately removed to conceal evidence related to the murder. Perhaps the removal of records was not accidental or administrative, but was a deliberate act to destroy evidence. By mid-June 1959, approximately 2 weeks after Elizabeth's death, the police investigation was officially closed. The police announced that no arrest had been made. The police announced that no suspect had been charged. The police announced that no clear conclusion had been reached about who had murdered Elizabeth Hartley. The official police statement indicated that the investigation had concluded that the murderer was unknown and that the case could not be resolved based on available evidence. The case was filed as an unsolved murder. The file was archived. Active investigation was halted. Hospital administration announced that the matter was now closed from the hospital's perspective. Hospital officials stated that the hospital's investigation had concluded. Hospital officials stated that no further investigation by hospital administration would be conducted. Hospital officials stated that the hospital could now move forward and focus on its normal operations. The speed with which the investigation was closed was striking and suspicious. Within 2 weeks, a murder investigation at a prominent hospital had been officially terminated without an arrest. Without a clear suspect, without a clear understanding of what had occurred, The official explanation was that the murderer could not be identified based on available evidence, but many observers questioned whether the investigation had truly been exhaustive, or whether hospital administration's interference had prevented the investigation from progressing as far as it might have progressed. The closure of the investigation represented a victory for hospital administration. The hospital had successfully resisted police investigation. The hospital had successfully protected itself from extended investigation and public scrutiny. The hospital's reputation, while temporarily damaged by the presence of a murder within the hospital, had been protected from the damage that would have resulted from a more extensive, more public investigation. Elizabeth Hartley's family in England received news of her death with shock and profound grief. Elizabeth's parents, now elderly, learned that their daughter had been murdered. They learned that their daughter had died far from home, in a foreign country, in circumstances that were violent and tragic. They learned that their daughter had been murdered in a hospital, in a place that should have been safe, in a place where she had worked professionally. Elizabeth's father, George Hartley, had retired from his career as a schoolmaster. Elizabeth's mother, Margaret, was widowed from any close professional or institutional connections. They had lived a quiet life, expecting to see their daughter, expecting to maintain connection with her, expecting that she would eventually return to England, or that they would visit her in South Africa. They had letters from Elizabeth describing her life in South Africa. They had photographs. They had maintained family connection across the distance. Now their daughter was dead. Now they would never see her again. Now they had to process the knowledge that their daughter had been murdered. Now they had to accept that their child, whom they had raised and educated and supported, had been killed by someone, and that no one was being held accountable for the crime. Elizabeth's parents requested that British authorities investigate the case, but British authorities had limited ability to investigate a murder that had occurred in South Africa. The British government had limited influence over South African police investigations. The British government could not compel South African authorities to continue an investigation that South Africa had officially closed. The British government could not force South African authorities to arrest individuals for a crime that South Africa was treating as unsolved. The British government could only express concern and sympathy, but could not effectively intervene in South African affairs. Elizabeth had siblings, brothers or sisters who shared her family connections. These siblings learned of their sister's death. They also processed grief, loss, the knowledge that their sister's murder had gone unpunished and unresolved. They grew to adulthood with the knowledge that their sister had been murdered and that her murderer had never been caught. This knowledge affected them throughout their lives. Elizabeth's family was devastated by the apparent lack of justice. They had lost their daughter to murder. They had also lost the possibility of knowing who had killed her, of seeing that person brought to justice, of achieving closure through the criminal justice system. The family was left with unanswered questions, with grief, with a sense that justice had not been served. The most striking aspect of the investigation's closure was the unanswered questions that persisted. The most striking aspect was the disappearance of patient records. The most striking aspect was the apparent lack of interest in pursuing the investigation further. Who had murdered Elizabeth Hartley? This fundamental question remained unanswered. The investigation had not identified a suspect. The investigation had not established a theory about who had committed the murder. The investigation had simply stopped without solving the crime. What was the motive for the murder? Why had Elizabeth been killed? What had prompted someone to commit murder? These questions remained unanswered. Why had patient records disappeared? Why had hospital administration been so determined to remove and conceal patient records? What information did these records contain that hospital administration believed needed to be concealed? These questions remained unanswered. Why had hospital administration been so insistent on controlling and obstructing the investigation? What interests had hospital administration been protecting? What did hospital administration fear would be revealed if the investigation had proceeded without obstruction? These questions remained unanswered. The most striking unanswered question was perhaps, what did hospital administration know? What information did hospital administration possess that motivated them to obstruct the investigation so thoroughly? Why were patient records so important that they needed to be removed and concealed? What truth was hospital administration protecting? The murder of Elizabeth Hartley remained officially unsolved. The case was filed away in police archives. The case received minimal attention in the decades that followed. The case faded from public consciousness. In the 1960s and 1970s, as apartheid intensified, and as South Africa became increasingly isolated internationally due to international condemnation of apartheid, the case of Elizabeth Hartley's murder received virtually no attention. The case was nearly forgotten by most of South African society. There were other cases, other crimes, other issues demanding attention. Periodically, the case would resurface, when journalists would investigate old unsolved murders, when researchers would study the history of crime in South Africa, when family members or interested parties would attempt to keep the case alive. But the investigation did not progress. No new evidence emerged. No arrest was ever made. The case remained frozen in time, unsolved, and apparently unsolvable. The patient records that had gone missing were never recovered. Hospital administration maintained that the records had been lost or mislaid. The records were not preserved. The information they contained was never made public or available for investigation. If the records had contained evidence relevant to the murder, that evidence was lost forever. The passage of decades made investigation increasingly difficult. Witnesses died or moved away. Memory of events faded. The social and political environment changed. But the basic facts remained. Elizabeth Hartley had been murdered, and the crime had never been solved. The case of Elizabeth Hartley's murder became emblematic of the way that powerful institutions in apartheid-era South Africa could interfere with justice, could obstruct the truth, could protect their own interests at the expense of accountability and truth-seeking. The case demonstrated the vulnerability of individuals working within institutions that prioritized institutional interests over individual rights and individual justice. Elizabeth had been a nurse working within a powerful institution. When she was murdered, the institution had moved to protect itself rather than to seek justice for her death. The institution had prioritized its own reputation, its own interests, its own power above the interests of finding the truth about how one of its employees had been killed. The case demonstrated the way that institutional power could be used to obstruct investigations, to prevent the truth from emerging, to protect perpetrators of crime from accountability. Hospital administration had used its power and its connections to government to obstruct the police investigation and to prevent the investigation from proceeding as it should have proceeded. The case demonstrated the corruption that could occur when institutions prioritized their own reputation and their own interests over justice and truth. Hospital administration had been more concerned about protecting the hospital's reputation than about seeking justice for a murdered employee. Hospital administration had been more concerned about protecting the hospital from scandal than about ensuring that the truth came out and that the person responsible for the murder was held accountable. In 2025, more than 66 years after Elizabeth Hartley's death, the case remains officially unsolved. The case remains in cold case files. The case remains one of South Africa's unsolved historical murders. Who murdered Elizabeth Hartley? This fundamental question remains unanswered. The investigation closed without identifying a suspect. The investigation closed without establishing a clear understanding of what had occurred. The investigation closed without achieving justice. What was contained in the patient records that disappeared? What information did these records contain that was significant enough to warrant their removal and concealment? These questions remain unanswered. If the records still existed, what would they reveal? What was the relationship between the disappearance of records and the murder of Elizabeth Hartley? Were these connected events? Did the patient records contain information related to the murder? Did the disappearance of records occur to conceal evidence of the murder? These questions remain unanswered. Why did hospital administration work so hard to obstruct the investigation? What did they fear would be revealed? What interest were they protecting? These questions remain unanswered. Was justice ever served in the case of Elizabeth Hartley's death? No. Elizabeth's murderer was never arrested. Elizabeth's murderer was never prosecuted. Elizabeth's murderer was never held accountable. Elizabeth's murderer has lived for 66+ years without facing legal consequences for the crime. If the murderer is still alive in 2025, they are now in their 80s or 90s, still never held accountable. Elizabeth Hartley remains a victim of unresolved murder. She remains a victim of institutional obstruction and institutional corruption. She remains a reminder that institutions have the power to obstruct justice, to conceal truth, to protect their own interests at the expense of the truth about serious crimes. She remains a reminder that power can be used to prevent justice from being served. The case of Elizabeth Hartley remains a dark chapter in the history of Cape Town and South Africa. The case remains a reminder that even in institutions dedicated to care and healing, violence can occur, and institutional power can be used to conceal that violence rather than to seek justice.